Well, welcome to this new analysis. Today we're going to unravel a deeply complex crisis that frankly affects much of Latin America, the expansion of drug trafficking. But look, instead of staying on the surface or the typical headlines of daily security news, we're going to go straight to the hidden root of the problem. We're going to explore that fundamental and systemic cause that the vast majority of conventional analyses completely overlook. To stay on track, this is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the power of drug trafficking. Then we'll look at false solutions and external geopolitics. We'll move on to the inertia of clientelism, analyze the regional political labyrinth, and finally reach the key to it all, autonomous organization. So we start with Section 1, the power of drug trafficking and the true roots of that power. To really understand how drug trafficking has completely changed the axis of power in the region, we have to talk about an absolutely vital concept, clientelism. Sources define it for us as that historical practice of exchanging political support for aid, jobs, or simple handouts. Of course, this creates a deep dependency in communities instead of fostering true citizenship. And what's really fascinating, or rather concerning, is that this clientelism acts as a kind of pre-existing disease. It's literally the wide open door that the cartels have masterfully exploited to seize institutions at all levels. If we analyze the exact steps of this process, we realize something key. The narco groups haven't invented a new system, but have simply hijacked the political system that already existed. Step 1 is to infiltrate. They flow over the networks of endemic corruption that are already installed in the institutions. In Step 2, they use their immense economic power to generate jobs and opportunities among the most excluded populations. Once established, in Step 3, they create their own economic and political clienteles, buying loyalties exactly as traditional politicians did. And finally, in Step 4, they end up completely displacing or absorbing those old power structures. Come on, it's an amazingly methodical manual of conquest. We now move to Section 2. False solutions and geopolitics, or what is the same, external interventions. If we shift focus and look at international actors, the sources show us a huge, almost ironic contrast between the stated goal and historical reality. On one hand, we have the famous narrative of the international fight against drug trafficking. But on the other hand, history shows that external interventions often don't align at all with that official goal. The original text cites very specific examples, from the historic Iran-Contra case, where drug trafficking was facilitated to fund armed groups, to more recent cases. In fact, it reports how former US President Trump pardoned former Honduran leader Juan Orlando Hernandez, who had been convicted precisely for facilitating massive cocaine trafficking. As impartial analysts of this material, the important thing here is to note how the source argues that geopolitical agendas frequently instrumentalize the problem instead of trying to solve it. And so we reach Section 3, the inertia of clientelism and the trap of welfare dependency and repression. At this point, it's logical to ask, why hasn't the region been able to face this phenomenon from within? Well, the document points to two dominant political responses, but they have failed miserably. On one hand, there's the welfare inertia, historically associated with broad sectors of the so-called democratic left. The argument here is that state welfare, combined with inherited corruption, has ended up demoralizing the popular bases and creating passivity. And as a reaction to this failure, from the right-wing spectrum, citizen indignation has been capitalized on by promoting iron fist solutions with a strictly punitive focus, like Bukele-style megaprisons. The text we are analyzing maintains a very clear stance. Both are false cures. One perpetuates social dependency, and the other applies repressive brute force, but neither resolves the deep conditions of exclusion that truly feed the cartels. Section 4, the regional political labyrinth and the current Latin American landscape. This constant lack of grassroots organization we've been talking about is not just a theoretical concept. The source shows us how it manifests in a super concrete way in today's Latin American political map. In Mexico, for example, although the text recognizes progress under the so-called Fourth Transformation, it critically points out a lack of solid grassroots organization that can guarantee permanent resistance against the cartels. In Chile, it's argued that the left took over the government but failed by not being able to offer concrete results, thus opening the door for the far right to come to power. If we look at Colombia and Brazil, important reforms are mentioned, yes, but with the same systemic flaw, failing to actively organize the popular bases against insecurity. And finally, the source launches a direct criticism of Cuba, arguing that its rigid system blocks the active incorporation of civil society. The common thread in all these scenarios is evident: the critical absence of a solidly organized citizen force. This leads us to Section 5 and the core of this analysis, autonomous organization and citizenship, the true foundation. Leaving behind the diagnosis of symptoms and those false cures, the central proposal of the sources to achieve resilience is forceful. Methods capable of forming citizens with autonomous organization for production and communal participation must be used. The document highlights the brilliant work of two great Brazilian educators, Clodomir Santos de Moraes and Paulo Freire. Their methodologies, applied for decades, represent the real organizational alternative from the social base itself. Basically, it's about using practical education and community business training, not to distribute state handouts, but to create truly autonomous and productive popular organizations. According to the text, this is the scientifically proven antidote both against passive clientelism and against simple brute repression. If we put both models side by side, the difference is abysmal. On one hand, we have the current system, a society kept in constant dependence on clientelism or subjected to an iron fist, which makes it tremendously vulnerable to being absorbed by drug trafficking networks. But against this stands the real alternative that the source defends: autonomous organization. In fact, the fundamental goal of this analysis is to highlight precisely this, the vital importance of autonomous organization as the only solid foundation for citizenship. Promoting comprehensive education and employment policies empowers communities to develop their own businesses and take on a leading role. Without this structural independence at the grassroots level, any state policy will inevitably be insufficient against the drug trafficking giant. And with all this panorama on the table, we are left with one final inevitable reflection. Will we manage to overcome that historical clientelist inertia to build a true autonomous citizenship in the face of the current crisis? This analytical journey makes it very clear that, to face the tremendous systemic violence and the constant threat to sovereignty, we cannot continue to depend on temporary solutions imposed from above or from outside. It is absolutely imperative to look toward the social base, educate it, and provide it with true economic and organizational independence. Because as the sources show us, that is the only real and lasting barrier against the control of drug trafficking. Thank you very much for joining us in this analysis to fully understand the root of this challenge. Until next time.